Hello everybody, welcome to the Junction City Journal. My name's Troy, and on this channel we're going to try to piece together some stories about the people and the events of Ogden's past. We're going to gather information from newspaper databases, the Utah State Archives, and other resources to piece together these stories that otherwise might be lost to history. These kind of things have always been a passion of mine, and I've always believed that everybody has a story to tell, and that we do everything that we can to make sure the stories are not forgotten. My partner in this endeavor is Shane Keyes, and he runs the Junction City Justice podcast. The link to Shane's podcast is in the description of the video. Shane will be bringing us dynamic stories about Ogden City's law enforcement past, and we hope through both of our endeavors, a little piece of Ogden's history that is both informative and entertaining. We're both new at this, so please forgive us if we're a little rough around the edges. All right, enough about us. Let's get to the video. Today we have a story for you about a murder which occurred in Ogden on April 9th, 1929. The murder took place at 214 24th Street, which is just a little bit east of Lincoln on 24th Street. The original building has long been torn down and has been replaced with a storefront or an office building that's there today. But let's think back at what it would be like to live in Ogden in April of 1929. Ogden's population was right about 34,000 at that time, and the railroad ensured that commerce and prosperity were coming to Ogden. Prohibition was in full force at that time and had been for about 9 years, and that ensured that Ogden had its own share of booze joints, speakeasies, and all sorts of bootlegging going on. In the early morning hours of April 9th, 1929, which was a Tuesday, I imagine that Ogden Police Detective Charles E. Noble was in bed when he received the phone call that there was a stabbing victim at the D Hospital. Now, Detective Noble was a veteran with the Ogden City Police Department at this time. He had worked the streets of Ogden since 1912. When Detective Noble responded to D Hospital, he was met by his partner, Detective Clifford Keeter. The detectives went inside the hospital and were led to an unconscious man on a gurney in an elevator. The man, identified as Jack Farish, died from a stab wound in his side just a few moments after the detectives had arrived. While conducting the investigation at the hospital, the detectives identified two men who had brought Jack to the hospital in a taxi. The two men, Max Pace and Robert Fields, both identified themselves as friends of Jack Farish. The two men were interviewed by the detectives, and both stated that they were at a get-together at 214 24th Street. They described an incident that occurred there where two women that they described as a mother and daughter began to argue. The argument ultimately turned physical, and then the mother went to the kitchen and grabbed a knife and stabbed Jack. Max Pace described how he and Bob Fields carried Jack outside and into the street. Max then ran to get a taxi, and Bob continued to carry Jack. Bob asked Jack if he was seriously hurt, and Jack replied, "Plenty." Although Max and Bob were clearly upset at the loss of their friend, they both were detained by the detectives as material witnesses. The detectives, along with other uniformed officers, then responded to the location of the crime. When the officers arrived at 214 24th Street, I'm sure they found a chaotic scene. They spoke to a man there named William Marsh, and after a few questions, they quickly identified him as a witness to the crime. They also found and detained the owner of the home, Mrs. Thelma Bruerton. Thelma stated that she and her husband owned the home, but her husband was currently in the Ogden City Jail, having served 30 days of a 90-day sentence for possession of liquor. Thelma's mother, Miss Esther Besares, was also found inside the home, along with another visitor, Arnold Wolski. The police officers searched the home, and in addition to a large blood stain found on the front room floor, they found a long, curved, blood-stained butcher knife in a cabinet drawer in the kitchen. When a police officer held up the knife, Thelma's mother, Esther, said that that was the knife that she used to stab Farish. The apparent confession by Esther coincided with the information the officers had obtained from the witnesses. Esther was arrested on the spot for the first-degree murder of Jack Farish. Her daughter Thelma was also arrested for keeping a disorderly house. The police also took into custody Max Pace, Robert Fields, William Marsh, and Albert Wolski as material witnesses. Now you're probably asking yourself a question as to why witnesses were taken into custody and literally booked into the Ogden City Jail. Well, it was a common practice back then to take witnesses into custody who the police suspected might not hang around until they could give testimony in court. So as strange as it might seem today, these people were literally taken into custody, driven to the Ogden City Jail, had their booking photo taken, their fingerprints taken, and placed in a jail cell until the time they could give testimony and their statements entered into the record of the court. In this case, the first court date was set the very next day, Wednesday, April 10th, and all parties involved would have their opportunity to testify. But before we get into the testifying at court the next day, I'd like to go over the main people involved and give you some information about them that I was able to piece together. John Farish, known as Jack to his friends, was born in October of 1896 in the town of Cleveland, Utah, which, I'm going to be honest with you, I had never heard of. Didn't know where it was until I did research for this video and discovered it was in central Utah, near the town of Castledale. There's really not much information, or more honestly, no information, on Jack in his younger years. I did discover that his father had passed away when he was 4 years old in 1900, and that his mother passed away in 1919. In June of 1918, Jack filled out a World War I era draft registration card, and it lists him as living in Somerville, Colorado, and working for the Utah Gas Company. Now, Jack did serve in World War I with the 81st Infantry Division and saw combat in the Meuse-Argonne battle. You can only imagine the hell that he must have experienced in that time period. Now, there's no indication anywhere that Jack was ever married or that he had any children. And I'll be honest with you, I was very frustrated that I couldn't find a photo of him. It would be nice to be able to build that personalization with a photo looking at somebody's face. Now, really, the only other information that I found outside of, the information relating to the incident that this story's about is in the 1920 U.S. Census. It has Jack living with his sister Mary and her husband John Coombs in Salt Lake City. It lists his occupation at that time as a student. I did discover in a few of the articles, or at least one of them, about this incident where Jack was killed, was that he was a known card player, potentially a gambler, to the police in both Ogden and Salt Lake. So I don't know if that's how he made his living or it was just his hobby. The only other information I have about Jack is that when he was killed on April 9th, he was buried in the Ogden City Cemetery on April 14th. The following day, a small article was published in the Ogden Standard Examiner, and this is what it said. Card of thanks. We desire to thank, through the columns of this paper, our many friends for their acts of kindness and sympathy tendered us during our bereavement in the passing of our brother, John Farish. We especially thank the American Legion, those who sent flowers to the bier and assisted us in any way, sisters and brothers of John Farish. John Farish, known as Jack to his friends, was 32 years old at the time of his death. Esther Alvira Besares was born Esther Clements in 1885 in Oxford, Idaho. She was one of 20 children. There isn't any information about her previous to 1902 when she married John A. Peterson in April of 1902. He had immigrated from Denmark and was 20 years older than her. They had one daughter, Thelma, in November of 1903. There's no clear date when Esther and John divorced, but they did previous to 1908 because in 1908 she married Arthur Ortleb. But Arthur died 5 years later when he was working as an electrician for the Merchants Power and Light Company, and he touched a high voltage wire which killed him instantly. In 1915, Esther married Ross Grocock, and they had one son together. His name was Wayne. There are no details how their marriage ended, but it did because in 1926 she married John Besares. He died in 1945. Thelma Esther Bruerton was born in 1903 in Oxford, Idaho. In February of 1924, she married Algernon Charles Douglas Blackman Bruerton, known as Al for obvious reasons, in Farmington, Utah. Al was born in the Chelsea section of London, England, which might help explain why he has 4 first names. Al was arrested in March of 1929 and charged federally with possession of liquor. On March 14, 1929, Al was sentenced to 90 days in the Weber County Jail. The next day, the Ogden Standard-Examiner published an article on how Al showed up to jail to start his sentence. It reads, "Makes ready for idle hours. Al Bruerton, 26, of 214 24th Street, appeared at the Weber County Jail Thursday and started to serve a 90-day jail sentence imposed recently in federal court on the charge of possession of liquor. Bruerton brought with him a case of oranges for the prisoners, a portable phonograph, records, and other articles for entertainment. So while Al served his 90-day sentence in the jail, his 26-year-old wife, Thelma, was left to take care of the home." At the end of this video, I will be adding information, postscript the trial of Thelma and Esther, as to what happened in their lives. But for now, let's get back to the court hearings and trial. On April 10, 1929, a coroner's inquest was held in the Ogden City Court. The purpose of this was to determine the facts and circumstances which led to Jack's death. On that very evening, the Ogden Standard-Examiner published an article detailing what occurred in the courtroom that day and what the witnesses testified to. What you're about to hear is the article read by my good friend Shane from the Junction City Justice podcast.
Inquest underway to sift facts in butcher knife case. Witness says drunken brawl was in progress in booze joint with mother fighting daughter over Jack Farish. Mrs. Besares grabs butcher knife and stabs gambler who dies shortly after friends take him to the hospital. A gory shirt and a big butcher knife were exhibited this morning before a coroner's jury in city court at the inquest into the death of Jack Farish, 32, who was stabbed early Tuesday. The shirt, of light green color, was one said to have been worn by the deceased when he was stabbed with the butcher knife following an argument at 214 24th Street. Max Pace, 27, one of the witnesses who testified at the morning session of the inquiry into the cause of the killing, declared that Mrs. Esther Besares stabbed Farish because she objected to Farish paying attention to her daughter, Mrs. Thelma E. Bruerton. The inquest was held in police court at the city jail before Municipal Judge Simon Barlow and was conducted by the county attorney Samuel E. Blackham and his assistant Kenneth Malin. The jurors are P. Ernestrum R. Mitchell and Luke Roghar. The court reporter sworn to take the testimony is J.L. May Jr. Noble is witness. The first witness called was Detective C. Everett Noble of the Ogden Police Department. The next witness was his old, reliable partner, Detective C.K. Keeter. The officers told of their going to the D hospital about 1:30 o'clock, interesting way of writing that standard, Tuesday morning, April 9th, and seeing Jack Farish unconscious on a stretcher in the elevator of the hospital where he died in a few moments. They said they took into custody Max and Robert Fields, who had taken Farish to the hospital in a taxi following the stabbing fray. They said they returned to the house at 214 24th Street and there took into custody William Marsh, alleged to have been another witness in the case. The officers identified the long curved butcher knife, blood-stained as the knife they found in a cabinet drawer at the residence of Mrs. Thelma Bruerton. They said that when shown the knife after the killing, Mrs. Esther Besares declared it was the weapon she had used to kill Farish. Dr. N.H. Savage, city physician, was the next witness called to the stand. He identified the shirt the deceased was wearing when he examined the body and pointed the knife thrust into the cloth and dark blood stains around the incision. He said that Farish died from internal bleeding caused by a wound under his left ribs in the abdomen. The weapon penetrated into the region of the kidney, the doctor said. I made a post-mortem examination of the body in the presence of Dr. Alfred Sorensen, hospital intern, said Dr. Savage, and determined the cause of death. The wound showed that it must have been an instrument about 1.5 inches or 2 inches wide and several inches long. Max Pace was the fourth witness called. He said he had known Farish 5 or 6 years. I came up here from Ephraim last week and stayed 2 nights with Jack Farish at the Alexander Hotel. About 5 or 6 o'clock Sunday morning, Thelma Bruerton came to Jack's room, and I got up and left and went to a cafe for some coffee. In the afternoon, I planned to meet my wife, who's living here in Ogden with her folks. Monday evening I was with Jack and stayed in his room. About 5 a.m., the girl, Thelma, came to the room. I got up and left. That afternoon, I met my wife and then later joined Jack. Monday evening, Thelma called by telephone and said to come over to 214 24th Street. I was playing rummy at a card place, and I gave my hand to another man and went to Mrs. Bruerton's house. When I got there about 10:30 or 11 p.m., Jack and Thelma were in the kitchen, and a man named Marsh and Mrs. Besares and a man named Wolski were in the front room. Later, some people came and danced and played the phonograph. Jack had a flask of whiskey. Thomas served some beer. Bob Fields came in. Bob Wheat came in and then left. After midnight, Thelma put on her coat and started to go out with Jack. Her mother, Mrs. Besares, said, "You are not going out with him." Words passed between the mother and daughter. Mrs. Besares called Jack some vile names and accused him of trying to break up a home. Jack replied to her, "You are mistaken." Then Thelma spoke up and said to her mother, "If I love Jack, I'm going to have him. He is a lot better than that man you live with." Then the mother and the girl started fighting in the dance hall. The mother had a knife. I did not see where she got it from. Jack was standing in the dance hall. Wolski, who had been friendly with Mrs. Besares, started for Jack. Bob Fields grabbed him. I told Wolski to stay out in the kitchen, or I would hit him with a chair if he tried to hurt Jack. The daughter and the mother were striking one another and quarreling. The mother's dress was torn. Mrs. William Marsh said, "Get Jack out of here." I told Bob Fields to take him out. Just then, Mrs. Besares dodged around Thelma and rushed for Jack. Mrs. Besares said, "I'll kill you," and then I heard Jack say, "Oh God, I'm stabbed." Fields and I started to walk out with Jack. He fell and went into a coma. We went out into the yard and I told Bob to carry him while I ran for a taxi cab. We put him in, went to the hospital, and he died there. When the noon recess was called from 12 to 1:30 p.m., the county attorney, the jurors, and police officers went to the Bruerton home at 214 24th Street to see the scene of the crime. When the inquest was called at 11 o'clock, L.J. Holder, Ogden attorney, announced that the firm of Woodley and Holder had been retained as counsel for the defense. Mr. Holder asked the court to postpone the inquest until he could be present to protect the rights of Mrs. Besares, who's facing a charge of first-degree murder, filed Tuesday in the office of David Folgery, clerk of the city court. The complaint is signed by Detective C.E. Noble. Mr. Holder said he had to be in Brigham City on a case and could not attend the inquest this morning. County Attorney Blackham objected to any delay in the matter, and Judge Barlow ordered the inquiry to proceed. The jurors were instructed that they must ascertain how, when, and by what means, person, or accident the deceased came to his death, and whether feloniously. The court was crowded with spectators. Relatives of Jack Farish were present. Several witnesses were scheduled to be called at the afternoon session. Mrs. Bruerton is the wife of Al Bruerton, who is serving 90 days in the Weber County Jail for recent conviction on federal charge of liquor law violations. When the county attorney and police officers searched the premises Tuesday, they found electric signaling devices, electric locks, secret hiding places which contained quantities of bottles, and other paraphernalia. The premise was padlocked. Al Bruerton, who is serving a 90-day term in the county jail imposed in the United States federal court recently for liquor law violation, has been denied the right to visit his wife and mother-in-law, who are being held in the city jail. According to Sheriff R.D. Pincock, Bruerton has repeatedly asked permission to visit his wife and mother-in-law, but under the circumstances, he has felt justified in denying the request. Robert Field was called to the stand this afternoon. He said he knew Farish since 1921. He said he was at the Al Bruerton home Monday night. County Attorney Samuel E. Blackham asked Field, "What kind of place is it?" Field replied, "Well, I guess you would call it a booze joint." Mr. Blackham then told Field to tell the story of the stabbing. Field said Tony, that's Thelma and her mother, got into an argument over Farish. Thelma said if he left, she would go with him. The two women were fighting when Mrs. Besares ran into the kitchen and got a knife. Jack was in the doorway. Thelma hit her mother in the face. Her mother gave her a throw and rushed at Jack. I said, "Are you hurt?" And he answered, "Plenty." I told Pace to run for a taxi, and I took Jack out, and we went to the hospital. When they told me he was dead, it just kind of hit me, and I went and stood on the steps until the officers arrived. It was a drunken brawl at the house. Mrs. Besares and Mrs. Bruerton were doing all the talking. Jack did not raise a hand against her. He did not even try to defend himself. Field demonstrated to the jury how Mrs. Besares made the knife thrust upward through the side of Farish. The knife measures 17 inches overall, 5 inches of a handle and 12 inches of a blade. The blade is 1¼ inches wide and curved like a saber. William Marsh, 33, was the next witness, and he related incidents leading up to the fatal argument. He said he and his wife had been living at the Bruerton home. He said Mrs. Besares was raving like a drunken person, and Wolski was trying to quiet her. Marsh said he did not see the fatal knife blow, but he later picked up the knife from the dance hall floor and put it in the cabinet drawer of the kitchen. As far as I recall, Jack never even spoke to Mrs. Besares all the time he was there, Marsh asserted. Mrs. Besares was called to the stand at 2:15 o'clock. When asked by the county attorney if she wished to testify, she said, "I'm willing to tell the truth." Mrs. Besares declared that Farish insulted her, and he put his arms around her daughter. "He hit me on the chest," Mrs. Besares declared. "Then I ran to the kitchen for a stick of wood or something to defend myself with. The first thing I saw was the knife. I came back, but I don't remember when I struck him. I had only had a couple or 3 drinks all evening." Mrs. Bruerton testified her mother had been in a, quote, ugly mood, that she had quarreled with Farish and had called him names. Farish, she said, threatened to strike the mother if she swore at him any more, but she said he had not struck Mrs. Besares. The daughter said the mother was the person who stabbed Farish. Mrs. Bruerton said Farish brought, quote, 2 pints, and she had about, quote, a pint and a half.
The coroner's jury returned the following verdict: that the said Jack Farish came to his death about 1 a.m., Tuesday, April 9th, 1929, by being feloniously stabbed with a large butcher knife by one Miss Esther Besares. The jury trial was set for early June of 1929. The trial started on a really nice spring day in Ogden in early June. The witnesses took the stand and testified to pretty much the same things that they had during the coroner's inquest, with 2 exceptions. The first was a surprise witness for the defense, and that would be Weber County Deputy Sheriff David Still, who testified that a few days prior to the murder, Miss Besares had contacted him and asked him to break up an affair between her daughter Thelma and Jack. The second surprise was when Miss Besares took the stand in her own defense, which even in 1929 was uncommon. She testified to seeing Jack with, quote, a compromising attitude towards her daughter, Thelma. She also testified that she did not remember stabbing Jack, saying that she was afraid and disgusted with the conduct of Jack towards her daughter. On the morning of June 7th, both the prosecution and the defense gave their closing arguments. The judge then instructed the jury on the law pertaining to this case, and by 2:30 in the afternoon, the jury was dismissed for deliberations. In a little less than 3 hours, the jury came back with a verdict. The verdict was Esther Besares was guilty of a lesser charge of voluntary manslaughter. On June 10th, Judge Simon Barlow sentenced Esther to 1 to 10 years in the Utah State Prison. Esther's defense attorneys stated that she was unfairly convicted and promised to appeal the case to a higher court. Esther was transferred to the Utah State Prison, where she would stay for not 10 years, not even 1 year, but only 10 months, until March of 1930. You see, Esther's lawyers had successfully argued her case all the way up to the Utah Supreme Court, who in a decision determined that the first trial had errors, and they remanded it back to Ogden City for a new trial, and that new trial would be in March of 1930. In 1917, the Utah legislature created a law which became the only one of its kind in the nation, and it describes homicide as justifiable when committed in a sudden heat of passion caused by the attempt of the deceased to commit a rape upon or defile the wife, daughter, sister, mother, or female relative or dependent of the accused, or when the defilement has actually been committed. In the first trial, the prosecution's case was based on the fact that there was no defilement of Esther's daughter, Thelma, by Jack. Prosecution's contention was that Thelma was an unchaste, married, and that her actions with Jack were premeditated on her part. They summed up their stance by stating that Thelma was a woman of easy virtue, and therefore the unusual law did not apply to this case. The defense obviously disagreed, and they contend that Esther was doing nothing more than a mother acting in the heat of passion at seeing her daughter being defiled by Jack's compromising attitude. The judge in the first trial agreed with the prosecution, and therefore the jury in that case was never instructed or given the option to find Esther not guilty based on this law, and that's why the Utah Supreme Court overturned the case and sent it back for a new trial. There's no doubt that there was elation with Esther and her lawyers over getting a new trial. The one risk of the whole thing was she was exchanging a sure thing 10-year sentence, no more than 10 years, for a new trial and the risk of the jury finding her guilty of first-degree murder and being sentenced to death. The second trial began on March 11th, 1930, just a little bit over 11 months since Jack had been killed. The biggest surprise in the second trial was that the prosecution couldn't find Max Pace, the main witness in this case, and therefore the jury would not hear from him the details that he testified to in the first trial, that in the days before the murder, Thelma had come to Jack's room and Max had left them alone. You can see how the prosecution would be worried that their star witness, the witness that could testify to facts that would bring Thelma's virtue into question, was nowhere to be found, and the lack of his testimony would be very detrimental to their case. Esther once again took the stand in her own defense. She testified that she only acted after Farish had struck her, and the slaying occurred in the heat of passion by her discovery of Farish in the act of defiling her daughter, Thelma, at a time when Thelma's husband, Bruerton, was in jail on a liquor charge and unable to protect his home. There was also a point of levity in the courtroom when the defense attorneys asked Robert Fields if he had spent much time in jail, and he responded with, "Yes, I've been doing life on the installment plan," which caused much laughter in the courtroom. Thelma would be seen occasionally coming into the courtroom and sitting next to her mother at the defense table. On one occasion, she could be heard quietly sobbing as the prosecution described her as a woman of being of easy virtue. On Saturday morning, March 15th, both the prosecution and the defense wrapped up the jury trial with their closing arguments. The judge then gave the jury its instructions, and the jury was excused to deliberate the fate of Esther. After only 2 hours and 45 minutes, the jury returned with a verdict. Esther was ordered to stand for the reading of the verdict. I can imagine her heart was racing, her palms were sweaty, her legs were shaking as the clerk read the verdict. Not guilty. In the Ogden Standard-Examiner's Sunday morning paper on March 16, 1930, it described Esther's reaction upon hearing the verdict. Here's what it said. "Oh my God," she cried out when the clerk announced that she was not guilty. Miss Besares shook hands with the jurors and thanked them as they filed out of court. Then she seized her attorneys, throwing her arms about their neck, started to kiss them, and then she wilted and fell into the floor in a faint. She was carried into Judge Barker's chambers and revived within about 10 minutes and was able to leave the building, a free person. So what do you think? Do you think justice was served in this case? Do you think Esther got away with murder? Or was she just following the law at the time? Let me know what you think in the comments below. After the trial, Thelma was sued for divorce by her husband Al, and after a lengthy and drawn-out process, the divorce was finalized. Thelma married Jack McGinnis and moved to Midvale, Utah. Jack died in 1962 and Thelma moved back to Ogden, living at 3231 Pingree. She worked at the Modale Beauty Salon on 23rd and Washington and was known as Mac by her customers. Thelma died at her home on January 13, 1978, at the age of 74. After the trial, Esther continued to live in Ogden with her husband John at 322 7th Street. Her husband died in 1943, and Esther carried on living in the home until January 8, 1965, when she died at her home after an extended illness. Esther was 79 years old at the time of her death.